Sarah Bennett's alarm failed to sound that morning, a small technological betrayal that would set in motion a chain of events she couldn't have anticipated. The soft morning light filtering through her bedroom curtains was already too bright, too late. She jolted awake, her heart racing as she grabbed her phone. 7:45 a.m. The guest lecture at Harvard Law School was scheduled for 9:30, and she still needed to drop off her son Marcus at school. "This cannot be happening," she muttered, quickly dialing her regular babysitter while simultaneously pulling a press blazer from her closet. The phone rang 5 times before going to voicemail. Sarah was halfway through leaving a message when a text popped up. "So sorry, Dr. Bennett. Sick with flu. Can't make it today." Marcus appeared in her doorway, already dressed in his school uniform, bowl of Cheerios in hand. At 10 years old, he had inherited his mother's sharp intuition. "Everything okay, Mom?" "Change of plans, buddy. We're going to need to move quick today." Sarah smiled, trying to mask her stress. She had spent weeks preparing for this lecture on racial disparities in the justice system. 300 law students would be waiting, not to mention the dean who had personally invited her. The morning became a blur of activity. Sarah stuffed her presentation materials into her leather briefcase, while Marcus gathered his backpack. As they rushed to the kitchen, her elbow caught her coffee mug, sending hot liquid cascading across her meticulously prepared note cards. No. She grabbed paper towels. But the damage was done, her handwritten margins now bleeding into sepia-toned smudges. "Mom, we're going to be late," Marcus called from the front door, his voice carrying that mixture of concern and impatience unique to children watching their parents struggle. The drive to Marcus's school was a testament to Murphy's Law. Every light turned red just as they approached. A garbage truck lumbered ahead of them for 3 blocks. Sarah's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel as she watched the minutes tick by on her dashboard clock. 8:35 a.m. when they finally pulled up to the school entrance. "Love you, Mom," Marcus said, giving her a quick hug before jumping out. Knock him dead at Harvard. Sarah managed a warm smile despite her stress. "Love you too, baby. Have a great day." She waited until he disappeared through the school doors before pulling away, her mind already calculating the fastest route to Cambridge. The GPS estimated 45 minutes with traffic. She had less than 30 minutes to make it. Sarah took a deep breath, reminding herself that she was Dr. Sarah Bennett, the youngest person ever tenured in Harvard Law School's history. She had testified before the Supreme Court twice. She could handle a tight schedule. The Massachusetts morning was deceptively beautiful, all golden sunshine and early autumn crispness. Sarah turned onto a familiar shortcut, a tree-lined street she'd driven countless times. Her briefcase sat in the passenger seat, containing not just her coffee-stained notes, but also her latest research on systematic bias in traffic enforcement, research that would soon prove ironically relevant. She was so focused on reviewing her lecture points mentally that she almost missed it. The flash of red and blue lights in her rearview mirror. Sarah's stomach dropped as she checked her speed. 32 in a 30 zone. Surely that wasn't it. She signaled and pulled over, muscle memory taking over as she positioned her hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. The police officer approached slowly, one hand resting on his holster, a detail Sarah noted with both academic and personal interest. She watched in the side mirror as he came closer, her heart rate quickening despite years of experience and expertise in law. In that moment, she wasn't Dr. Sarah Bennett, celebrated legal scholar and expert witness. She was simply another black woman being pulled over on a quiet suburban street, about to be very, very late for a very important date. The Suffolk County Courthouse loomed against the October sky, its granite facade casting long shadows across the busy morning street. Sarah Bennett stood at the base of the steps, taking in the neoclassical columns that seemed to mock the very notion of justice with their imposing presence. 3 weeks had passed since the traffic stop, but the officer's words still echoed in her mind. "License and registration, ma'am." Running that stop sign wasn't very smart, was it? Inside, the metal detector beeped as Sarah passed through. The security guard, an older black man with kind eyes and graying temples, gave her a knowing look as he waved her forward. "Courtroom 7, he asked, noting her purposeful stride. "Is it that obvious?" Sarah adjusted the strap of her briefcase. "Judge Richardson's morning crew all have that same look." He lowered his voice. "Word of advice. He's been especially prickly since his wife left him for a law professor. Ironic, considering." He trailed off, eyeing her professional attire. The courthouse hallway hummed with nervous energy. A mix of defendants, lawyers, and court officers hurrying in different directions. Sarah passed a young public defender consoling a tearful client, catching fragments of their whispered conversation. "Just take the plea deal. Richardson never reduces traffic fines." Sarah's heels clicked against the marble floor as she approached Courtroom 7. Through the heavy wooden doors, she could hear Judge Richardson's voice, sharp with authority. "Young man, if you can afford those designer sneakers, you can afford this fine." Next case. A teenager emerged, clutching a crumpled citation, his face a mask of helpless frustration. Sarah held the door for him, their eyes meeting briefly in a moment of silent solidarity. Inside, the courtroom was a study in power dynamics. Judge Michael Richardson, perched high on his bench, his silver hair and black robes creating an aura of untouchable authority. Sarah took a seat in the gallery, using the time to observe. The judge's pattern became clear: quick judgments, minimal patience for explanations, a clear preference for punitive measures over understanding. She opened her briefcase, reviewing her evidence one last time. Photographs of the obscured stop sign, statements from local residents, and beneath it all, a copy of her latest Harvard Law Review article on racial bias in traffic court proceedings. "Sarah Bennett," the clerk called out, her voice carrying across the now quiet courtroom. As Sarah approached the bench, she noticed the subtle shift in the room's atmosphere. The few remaining defendants leaned forward, perhaps sensing something different about her demeanor. The court officer straightened his posture. Even the bored-looking stenographer seemed to pay closer attention. Judge Richardson barely glanced up from his papers. "Another stop sign violation. How do you plead?" "Not guilty, Your Honor." Sarah's voice was clear and measured. "I'd like to present evidence regarding the visibility of the sign in question and discuss several relevant precedents about proper traffic signage requirements." The judge's head snapped up, irritation flashing across his features. "Ms. Bennett, this is traffic court, not a law school classroom. We don't have time for lengthy presentations about stop signs. The officer's report states clearly that you ran it." Sarah felt the familiar weight of assumption settling on her shoulders. She could correct him now. "It's Dr. Bennett, actually," but years of experience had taught her about timing. Instead, she reached for the manila envelope containing her photographs. "Your Honor, if I could just show you these images." "Ms. Bennett," he cut her off, emphasizing the Ms. with subtle condescension. "I've been doing this for 30 years. Every day, people come in here with excuses and photographs and stories. The fine is $300. Pay it or contest it formally. But either way, we're done here." The young public defender from the hallway had slipped into the courtroom and was watching intently. Sarah could feel his eyes on her back as she made her decision. She thought of her son Marcus, of all the teachable moments she'd shared with him about standing up for what's right. "In that case, Your Honor," she replied, her voice carrying a quiet confidence that made several heads turn, "I'd like to request a formal hearing, and I'll be representing myself." Judge Richardson's pen paused mid-signature. For the first time that morning, he really looked at her. Sarah met his gaze steadily, already mentally preparing for the next round. Sometimes, she knew, justice required a longer game. 2 weeks later, Sarah returned to Courtroom 7 for the formal hearing. The morning light filtered through the tall windows, casting prison bar shadows across the worn carpet. She had arrived early, watching as Judge Richardson handled case after case with mechanical efficiency. Each judgment came faster than the last, like a factory line of justice. "The court calls Sarah Bennett," the clerk announced, her voice carrying a note of curiosity. Perhaps she had noticed Sarah's detailed motion filing, so unlike the typical traffic court paperwork. Sarah approached the bench, her heels echoing in the now hushed courtroom. The same young public defender from her previous appearance sat in the back row, postponing his own cases to watch. Next to him, a law student furiously scribbled notes, clearly sensing something worth observing. "Ms. Bennett," Judge Richardson began, not bothering to look up from his papers, "I see you filed quite the extensive motion regarding your stop sign violation." His tone carried the weariness of a man who viewed such effort as a personal inconvenience. "Yes, Your Honor," Sarah began, placing her documents on the podium. "If I may direct your attention to Exhibit A, which clearly shows—" "Ms. Bennett," he interrupted, finally looking up with thinly veiled irritation. "This is a simple traffic violation. You ran a stop sign. Officer Williams, who has served this community for 15 years, witnessed it directly. Are you suggesting he fabricated his report?" Sarah maintained her composure, though her pulse quickened. "No, Your Honor. I'm presenting evidence that the stop sign in question was obscured by overgrown foliage, making it impossible for any driver to—" "Impossible?" Judge Richardson's eyebrows rose. "That's quite a claim. Tell me, Ms. Bennett, are you a traffic safety expert?" A slight smile touched Sarah's lips, but she held back. "Not yet. Your Honor, if you'll allow me to continue, I've prepared a brief citing relevant case law about municipal liability in cases of improperly maintained traffic signals, starting with Thompson v. City of Boston, where the Massachusetts Supreme Court held." "Ms. Bennett," the judge's voice cracked through the air like a whip, "this is not a law school lecture. This is traffic court. You ran a stop sign. The fine is $300. Every minute we spend on your amateur legal theories is a minute taken from other citizens waiting their turn." The young public defender shifted forward in his seat. Several other observers had stopped pretending to look at their phones. Even the court officer seemed invested now. "With all due respect, Your Honor," Sarah continued, her voice steady, "the Supreme Court has consistently held that due process requires—" "Due process." Judge Richardson let out a short, harsh laugh. "Perhaps you've watched too many legal dramas, Ms. Bennett. This is reality. In reality, you have two choices: pay the fine or appeal it to a higher court. Although I should warn you," he added with a patronizing smile, "appeals cost considerably more than $300. Sarah felt a familiar heat rising in her chest. Not anger, but the calm determination that had carried her through Harvard Law, through her doctoral defense, through countless courtrooms much higher than this one. She reached into her briefcase, fingers brushing past the photographs of the obscured stop sign to touch something else. Her Harvard Law Review article, the one Justice Sotomayor had cited just last month. The judge was still talking, his voice droning on about responsibility and respect for law enforcement. But Sarah noticed something he didn't. The young law student in the gallery had just recognized her, his eyes widening as he whispered urgently to the public defender beside him. "Your Honor," Sarah interrupted quietly but firmly, "before you proceed with your judgment, I believe there's one more piece of evidence you should review. Ms. Bennett, I've warned you about wasting this court's time." "It's actually Dr. Bennett," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the suddenly silent courtroom. "And this evidence isn't about the stop sign. It's about judicial bias in traffic court proceedings. In fact," she added, pulling out her article with deliberate slowness, "you may have read my work. The Supreme Court certainly has." For the first time that morning, Judge Michael Richardson was completely silent. The week between hearings felt like preparing for battle. Sarah sat in her home office late into the night, surrounded by stacks of papers and open laptop screens. Her son Marcus poked his head in, carrying 2 mugs of chamomile tea. "Mom, it's almost midnight," he said, placing one mug carefully between her papers. "Is this all for that stop sign?" Sarah looked up, smiling at her perceptive child. "It stopped being about the stop sign the moment that Judge decided I wasn't worth listening to." She pulled Marcus close, kissing the top of his head. "Sometimes, baby, you have to fight the small battles to win the bigger war." The next morning, Sarah returned to the intersection where she'd been stopped. The October air was crisp as she set up her camera, documenting the stop sign from every angle. The branches had grown even thicker, making the sign almost invisible from the approaching direction. "You must be the professor everyone's talking about," a voice called out. Sarah turned to find an elderly man walking his dog. "Name's Frank Thompson. Retired traffic engineer. Been complaining about this intersection for years." "Really?" Sarah pulled out her phone, starting to record. "Mr. Thompson, would you mind telling me more about that?" Over the next few days, Sarah's investigation deepened. She discovered a Facebook group called Bradford Street Traffic Nightmares, with over 200 members. Post after post described near misses at the obscured stop sign. More disturbing were the patterns she began to notice in the comments. "Only certain people seem to get tickets here," one resident wrote. "Wonder why that is." Sarah's legal training kicked in. She filed public records requests for traffic citation data from the intersection. The numbers told a story that made her stomach turn. Black drivers were 5 times more likely to receive citations at this specific location than white drivers. In her Harvard office, Sarah dug deeper. She pulled up her own published works on traffic law enforcement disparities, including her landmark study that had been cited in recent Supreme Court decisions. But something else caught her eye. A case from 1998 where a young Judge Richardson had actually written a thoughtful opinion about municipal liability for poorly maintained traffic signals. "The irony," Sarah muttered, printing the opinion. Her phone buzzed. A text from the young public defender she'd met in court. "Dr. Bennett, you should know. 3 other black professionals contacted my office this week. Same officer, same judge, same intersection. They want to talk." Sarah leaned back in her chair, thinking of all the times she testified before Congress about systemic bias. Now it was playing out in her own backyard. That evening, as she prepared dinner, Marcus watched her laying out documents on their dining room table. "Mom," he asked, "remember when you told me that sometimes the law isn't fair, but we have to work to make it better?" Sarah paused, carrots half chopped. "I remember. Is that what you're doing now?" She looked at her son, then at the scattered evidence of institutional bias spread across their dinner table. "Yes, baby. That's exactly what I'm doing." Late that night, Sarah crafted her argument. She wove together the local evidence, photographs, resident testimonies, citation statistics, with broader legal principles from her academic work. The document ran to 42 pages, far longer than any traffic court brief had a right to be. But the final touch came at 2 a.m. Sarah added one last exhibit, Judge Richardson's own words from 1998, arguing passionately for government accountability in traffic safety. She highlighted the key passage. "When those entrusted with public safety fail to maintain proper signage, they breach not only their duty of care, but the public's fundamental trust in fair governance." Sarah sent the completed brief to her printer, watching as page after page emerge. In a few hours, she would walk back into that courtroom, armed with irrefutable evidence of both the specific issue and its broader implications. But more than that, she would enter carrying the weight of every dismissive comment, every assumption, every time someone had decided her credentials or her humanity were less important than their preconceptions. Sometimes, she whispered to herself, echoing her words to Marcus, "You have to fight the small battles to win the bigger war." Courtroom 7 was unusually crowded that morning. Word had spread through the legal community about the Harvard professor challenging a traffic ticket, and the gallery seats were filled with curious observers. Judge Richardson noticed the unusual attendance, but maintained his stern demeanor as Sarah approached the bench. "Before we begin, Ms. Bennett," he started, wielding the incorrect title like a subtle weapon. "Dr. Bennett," Sarah corrected quietly, opening her briefcase. The murmur that rippled through the courtroom was barely perceptible, but she felt it. "And if it pleases the court, I'd like to begin with the traffic engineering assessment of the intersection in question." Judge Richardson's jaw tightened, but he gestured for her to proceed. Sarah pulled out the first set of photographs, now mounted on professional boards. Your Honor, these images, taken over a 3-week period, demonstrate the progressive obstruction of the stop sign at Bradford and Maple. She handed the exhibits to the clerk. But more importantly, I'd like to introduce Mr. Frank Thompson, a retired traffic engineer with 30 years of experience, who has documented this hazard repeatedly over the past 5 years. Frank stood up from his seat in the gallery, and Sarah caught the slight shift in Judge Richardson's posture. This wasn't going to be the easy dismissal he'd anticipated. Furthermore, Sarah continued, her voice gaining strength, I've compiled statistical evidence of citation patterns at this intersection. She produced a color-coded chart. As you can see, there's a significant disparity in enforcement that correlates directly with driver demographics. The young public defender who'd been following her case was now frantically taking notes. Several law students had pulled out their phones, trying to Google her name discreetly. Dr. Bennett, Judge Richardson interrupted, the new form of address carrying the hint of uncertainty. While this is all very thorough, I fail to see how demographic patterns relate to your specific violation. Sarah allowed herself a small smile. I'm glad you asked, Your Honor, because this brings me to Commonwealth v. Rodriguez, a case you're intimately familiar with. She pulled out his own 1998 opinion. In fact, you wrote quite eloquently about the intersection of traffic safety and equal protection under the law. The color drained slightly from Judge Richardson's face as he recognized his own words. But Sarah wasn't finished. From her briefcase, she withdrew the Harvard Law Review article that had made her famous in legal circles. This peer-reviewed study, cited last month by the Supreme Court, establishes a clear framework for identifying systemic bias in traffic enforcement. She paused, letting the weight of her credentials sink in. The same framework, I should note, that demonstrates a troubling pattern in this very courtroom. The gallery erupted in whispers. Judge Richardson's gavel cracked against the sound block. Order, he commanded, but his voice lacked its usual authority. Your Honor, Sarah continued, her tone professional but firm, this case isn't merely about a hidden stop sign. It's about the fundamental principles of due process and equal protection that you yourself championed early in your career. She laid her final exhibit on the presentation table, a compilation of testimonies from other professionals who'd received citations at the same intersection. The judge stared at the document, then at Sarah, seeing her truly for the first time. Dr. Bennett, he said slowly, are you suggesting? I'm not suggesting anything, Your Honor. The evidence speaks for itself. Sarah straightened her shoulders. And given your own published opinions on municipal liability and equal protection, I trust you'll give it the consideration it deserves. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. The law students had abandoned all pretense of discretion, openly recording the proceedings. The court clerk sat frozen, pen hovering above her notepad. Judge Richardson removed his glasses, pinching the bridge of his nose. When he looked up again, his expression had transformed from one of authority to one of dawning recognition, not just of Sarah's credentials, but of his own role in the very system she'd spent her career studying. Dr. Bennett, he said finally, I believe we need to take a brief recess, and perhaps, he glanced at the growing crowd of spectators, we should continue this discussion in chambers. Sarah nodded, gathering her materials. As she turned to follow the bailiff toward the judge's chambers, she caught sight of Frank Thompson, giving her a subtle thumbs up from the gallery. The small battles, she reminded herself, sometimes lead to the biggest changes. Judge Richardson's chambers felt smaller than Sarah expected. Gone was the theatrical authority of the courtroom. Here, surrounded by law books and family photos, he seemed almost human. He gestured for her to take a seat in one of the leather chairs facing his desk. I've been on the bench for 27 years, he began, still standing. His fingers traced the spine of a nearby law book. Sarah noticed it was volume 84 of the Harvard Law Review, the one containing her article. In all that time, I don't think I've ever felt quite so. He paused, searching for the right word. Challenged, Sarah offered quietly. Humbled, he corrected, finally sitting down. Dr. Bennett, I've read your work. I cited your research in at least 3 opinions. Yet when you walked into my courtroom, he trailed off, the implications hanging heavy in the air. Sarah leaned forward slightly. Your Honor, may I speak frankly? He nodded, removing his reading glasses. 3 weeks ago, I was just another black woman in your courtroom. You saw what you expected to see. Someone making excuses, someone beneath your notice. The only difference today is that you learned about my credentials. The judge's face flushed. Dr. Bennett, But here's the thing, she continued, her voice gentle but firm. Every person who walks into that courtroom deserves the same respect, the same attention to detail, the same presumption of intelligence and dignity that you're showing me now. Through the window, they could hear the murmur of the waiting crowd outside. Word had spread beyond the courthouse. Local media had begun to gather. Your opinion in the Rodriguez case, Sarah pulled out the document, shows that you understand these issues. You wrote about the invisible barriers to justice that exist in our legal system. You argued passionately for equal treatment under the law. Judge Richardson picked up the paper, his eyes scanning his own words from decades ago. I was a different person then, he said softly. Younger, more idealistic. Were you wrong? He looked up sharply. No, I wasn't. Sarah reached into her briefcase one final time, producing a slim folder. These are the stories of 12 other professionals, doctors, lawyers, business owners, who've received citations at that same intersection. All of them black. All of them treated with the same dismissive attitude I encountered. The only difference is they didn't have the legal background to challenge it. The judge began reading through the testimonies, his face growing more troubled with each page. One story was from a pediatric surgeon who missed an emergency surgery because of prolonged detention at a traffic stop. Another from a high school principal who had to explain to her students why she was treated like a criminal. I never meant. He started, then stopped himself. But that's the point, isn't it? Intention doesn't matter as much as impact. Sarah nodded. Outside, they could hear cameras clicking as reporters gathered. This story was bigger than either of them now. What would you suggest? He asked, and for the first time since she'd entered his courtroom, Sarah heard genuine humility in his voice. Start with the stop sign, she said. Use your authority to demand proper maintenance of traffic signals in all neighborhoods. Then perhaps we could look at implementing bias training for the entire court staff. She paused, and maybe, just maybe, we could work together on a more comprehensive review of traffic court procedures. Judge Richardson stood up, walking to his window. The crowd outside had grown. You know this isn't just about a traffic ticket anymore. It never was, Sarah replied. He turned back to face her. Dr. Bennett, I owe you an apology. But more than that, I owe an apology to everyone who's faced similar treatment in my courtroom. Actions speak louder than words, Your Honor. He nodded, straightening his robes. Shall we return to court? I believe I have some matters to address. As they walked back toward courtroom 7, Sarah thought about her son Marcus, about the world she was fighting to create for him. Sometimes change came from unexpected places, even from a traffic ticket and a hidden stop sign. The atmosphere in courtroom 7 had transformed during their absence. News reporters filled the back rows, their phones discreetly recording despite the no electronic signs. Local attorneys had slipped in, sensing a moment of legal history in the making. The young public defender now sat with a small group of his colleagues, all leaning forward in anticipation. Judge Richardson took his seat, but something was different. The physical elevation of his bench suddenly seemed at odds with his demeanor. He cleared his throat, the sound echoing through the now silent courtroom. Before we proceed with Dr. Bennett's case, he began, emphasizing her proper title, I have some remarks to make. He paused, removing his reading glasses. In 1998, I wrote an opinion about the responsibility of our courts to maintain equal justice. Somewhere along the way, I forgot my own words. Sarah sat quietly at the defendant's table, watching the man she'd faced across 3 hearings transform before her eyes. The judge continued, his voice growing stronger. Dr. Bennett came to this court not just to contest a citation, but to hold up a mirror. What I saw reflected was not the jurist I aspired to be. He turned to face Sarah directly. Would you share with the court your story about your father, the one you mentioned in chambers? Sarah stood, smoothing her skirt. She hadn't expected this request, but she understood its importance. My father was a civil rights attorney in Mississippi, she began, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. In 1975, he was held in contempt of court for insisting on being called Mr. Bennett instead of just Bennett. The judge said he was being uppity. A collective intake of breath from the gallery. Judge Richardson nodded for her to continue. That night, he sat me down and said, Sarah, baby, sometimes people will try to strip away your dignity. Your job isn't just to hold on to it. It's to help others find theirs too. She paused, looking around the courtroom. I became a lawyer because of that moment, but I became a teacher because I realized that changing the system requires more than just winning cases. The young public defender wiped something from his eye. Even the court reporter had stopped typing, caught up in the moment. My father passed away last year, Sarah continued, her voice softening. But his last case was helping a young man who'd been wrongfully convicted based on a traffic stop. He believed, as I do, that justice doesn't have size requirements. Every interaction with the law shapes people's faith in the system. Judge Richardson leaned forward. Dr. Bennett, would you be willing to share your expertise with this court? Not as a defendant, but as a consultant to help us identify and address our blind spots. Sarah thought of Marcus, of how he'd asked her just that morning why she was still fighting over a stop sign. Your honor, I would be honored. Then let me start by making this right. He picked up his gavel. Case dismissed. Furthermore, I am ordering an immediate review of all traffic citations issued at the intersection in question over the past 5 years. The gallery burst into applause, quickly silenced by the bailiff's stern look. But the energy in the room was undeniable. Additionally, the judge continued, I am establishing a task force to review our court's procedures for implicit bias. Dr. Bennett, if you're willing to chair this initiative. Yes, Sarah answered simply. As the formal proceedings concluded, people began approaching Sarah. Other defendants with similar stories, attorneys offering support, reporters requesting interviews. But her attention was drawn to the back of the courtroom, where Frank Thompson, the retired traffic engineer, was shaking hands with the young public defender. Judge Richardson stepped down from the bench, something he rarely did while court was still in session. He walked over to Sarah, extending his hand. Dr. Bennett, he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Thank you for teaching an old judge a new lesson. Sarah took his hand, thinking of her father, of Marcus, of all the small moments that led to big changes. Thank you, Your Honor, for being willing to learn. 6 months had passed since the hearing that transformed Courtroom 7. Sarah sat in her Harvard office, sipping morning coffee while reviewing the latest statistics from the Suffolk County courts. The numbers told a story of change. Traffic citation appeals were up 40%, while dismissal rates had equalized across racial demographics. Her phone buzzed. A text from Marcus. Mom, they're talking about you in social studies. Teacher mentioned the Bennett guidelines. Sarah smiled. The informal name had stuck, even though the official title was Suffolk County Traffic Court Procedural Reform. The guidelines, co-authored with Judge Richardson, had been adopted by 3 neighboring counties and were being considered statewide. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. The young public defender, now working with her on the court's bias task force, stood in the doorway, clutching a newspaper. Dr. Bennett, have you seen this? He spread the Boston Globe on her desk. The headline read, Traffic Stop Reform Leads to Broader Justice. How one woman's stand changed a system. James, she said, noting his excitement, we both know headlines simplify things. But look at the numbers, he insisted, flipping to the continued story. Complaint filings against officers down 35%. Civilian satisfaction with court interactions up 60%. And that stop sign. They didn't just fix it, they've revamped the entire city's traffic signal maintenance program. Sarah leaned back in her chair, remembering the morning everything began. How's Judge Richardson doing with the new procedures? James grinned. You wouldn't believe it. Yesterday, he spent 20 minutes listening to a grandmother explain why she couldn't see a speed limit sign. Then he ordered a visibility study of the entire street. The afternoon found Sarah back at the courthouse, this time as a speaker. The task force had organized mandatory monthly training sessions for court personnel. Today's topic: the cumulative impact of minor interactions in the justice system. Judge Richardson sat in the front row, taking notes, a sight that still surprised her. As she discussed implicit bias and systemic change, she noticed the court clerks nodding, the bailiffs engaged, the prosecutors leaning forward. The true measure of justice, she concluded, isn't how we treat people we respect. It's how we treat everyone else. After the session, Judge Richardson approached her. I had an interesting case this morning, he said. Young man. Traffic violation. But something felt off about the stop. Thanks to your training, I knew what questions to ask. He paused. Turns out the officer's bodycam footage didn't match his report. Case dismissed. Progress, Sarah nodded. Baby steps, he agreed. But they add up. That evening, driving home, Sarah passed the infamous intersection. The stop sign stood clear and visible, free from any obstruction. New reflective strips had been added, along with a solar-powered warning light. She stopped completely, smiling at the recently updated signal notice below it. Marcus was waiting at home, homework spread across the kitchen table. Mom, he called out as she entered, can you help me with my civics project? We're supposed to write about how ordinary citizens can change their communities. Sarah set down her briefcase, thinking about the chain of events that had started with a hidden stop sign and ended with systemic reform. Actually, baby, I think I can help with that. Her phone buzzed one last time. An email from the state Supreme Court. They'd wanted her to chair a commission on reforming traffic court procedures statewide. The subject line read, because small changes lead to big justice. As she helped Marcus with his project, Sarah reflected on her father's words about dignity. The changes they'd implemented weren't just about traffic stops or court procedures. They were about recognizing the humanity in every person who walked through those courthouse doors. Mom, Marcus asked, looking up from his paper, are you proud of what you did? Sarah thought about the grandmother Judge Richardson had listened to, the young man whose case was dismissed, the court staff learning to check their biases. She thought about all the people who would never know their lives were better because one person decided to fight a traffic ticket. I'm proud of what we all did, she answered. Sometimes, baby, justice is like a stone thrown in a pond. You never know how far the ripples will reach.